I want to thank the panel. It's really very exciting to hear the range of methodologies that are used and the different units of analysis, moving from some of the work you've been doing, Jaana, around relationships, thinking a bit more about the brain and the body, and thinking then with Dorothy's work about romantic relationships in that context, and then going back to more macro perspective. So we do have a time now to open it up for questions, and we have mics on both sides. I would ask that when people do have questions, if you wouldn't mind just briefly introducing yourself. No need to go into great detail, but it just provides a little bit of context for our understanding of your question. So while you all are lining up to ask some questions, I have a couple, and I alluded to one around this issue of connectedness that seems to kind of filter through a lot of the different presentations, who you're connected to when those relationships go awry in the case of the work that Tracy's been doing, and Dorothy as well, where it's a romantic relationship in Dorothy's work, or a parenting or peer relationship in the context of abuse. And then the idea that people are really seeking out individuals and targeting them and misrepresenting their relationships. So I didn't know if you all, I'm kind of drawn to the concept of connectedness, drawing initially from some of Michael Resnick's work that had come out of correlational work out of the adolescent health longitudinal study. And Michael Resnick and colleagues, including Bob Blum, had identified this concept of connectedness to peers, and it has since been extended to schools and is a facet of school climate that many of the school climate promoting interventions focus on. So I didn't know if that theme around connectedness resonated with you all, or I welcome counter thoughts around that too.
Well, let me make a quick comment on it, because I want to go back to, I on purpose contrasted individual differences to situational and contextual factors, but I want you to understand what I'm after is that it is the environments that are going to make kids socially isolated. They are not socially isolates unless other people ignore them. So that's why the efforts, for example, to force the connectedness by changing school climate are really, really important.
Robert, any thoughts around your perspective on connectedness? Yeah, no, if you could turn on your mic.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I want to reiterate actually a point from Jaana's talk, which is that having a friend, and we see this evidence in our data as well, we see that having a single friend actually is quite important for both reducing the risk of being bullied compared to being a social isolate, and also reducing the negative effects of being bullied. But what we also see on the other end is that there's such a thing as having too many friends, and that there is a dark side to that. So,
just to add it, I think it's even more, I mean, obviously we all recognize how complicated this is, but there was a recent paper that came out by Mara Berengren that looked at whether or not, so it's like shared plight. So if you're bullied and your best friend's bullied, does that confer a risk for depression? And you're more likely to be depressed if your friend's not bullied, because then you blame yourself, your attributions, which then fits in with Maston's study that just came out in developmental science, and that was using ERP, or maybe it was fMRI, and they looked at the cyberball task again. And so the person was primed to be rejected, and then they witnessed somebody being included within the cyber task, and they scanned the brains and looked at how that person perceived the acceptance following their rejection, and they were very distressed by it. The brain perceived that as distressing. But if they were rejected and the person was rejected thereafter, the brain didn't perceive it. It wasn't picking up distress signals. So I think it's, it's that shared reality. You kind of look around, and it speaks to all that when you were looking at the stuff about within groups, so within ethnicity, within sex. So I think when you look around, if there's high victimization within the classroom, you probably are going to fare better, which sounds counterintuitive, but because you don't blame yourself. But when you're the only person that's being picked on, you blame yourself, and it really it's really linked to very poor outcomes in terms of mental health.
I would add to that, most of the school-based work that I do centers around connectedness and relationships, and that's relationships within the students in the classroom. But after our last randomized clinical trial, we had this great quantitative data that showed that we had reductions in physical fighting and homophobic name-calling and sexual harassment perpetration, and that's great. That's wonderful, great effect sizes. I think the most telling was when we did follow-up focus groups with the kids and the teachers, and they talked about the 3 years of the curriculum. And the number one theme from both the teachers said, it was the first time that I actually got to know my students because I did something, and they would call it soft skills, but something beyond academics. And the kids could recall some strategies that they used that bettered their relationships at home with their siblings, and even they taught their parents some things, right, around socio-emotional learning. But they also said it was the first time that my teacher asked me about something that wasn't related to a test, and that I had an opinion. And we created, and I think the mechanism is just that, connectedness.
Yeah, and that highlights another form of connectedness to adults, and quite often it's operationalized as someone at the school that I can go to if I have problems or cares about me. It's a very similar extension to some of the work, Jaana, that you've been doing about peer-to-peer kind of connection. So I think we have a couple of questions that we'll hear from the audience.
Hello, I'm Beth Edgerton from HRSA Maternal Child Health Bureau. And full disclosure, as the pediatrician, so struck between the interventions at the school-based and being a genetics major, loving the genetics. So this question pretty much is for Tracy, in the sense of you really presented some compelling evidence for us to have a better understanding of this chronic stress and the mechanisms. How do we make that to that next step? Because as you said, we don't all carry our little profile genetic card of what our polymorphism is. And again, that struggle in labeling people with their genetic profile, and will they be that vulnerable individual? And if you could kind of forecast that next to 5, 10 years of where do we bring all of these sectors together? Because again, I think that's another goal of this workshop is all of us are focusing in different venues, but how do we integrate all of this wonderful knowledge?
It's a great question, and it's complicated. We'll be saying this, I think, for the next 2 days. But the reason why I'm so motivated in this area is that I'm tired of people being re-victimized by educators who then think there's something about them that's wrong, and they need to suck it up and just be tougher. So I don't think that we should ever get to the point where we have a cue card that says, my 5-HTT is short, so don't mess with me because I'm going to be quite vulnerable, right? I don't think that that's where we're going to get. But I do think that understanding that then makes it so that principals and parents, other adults in the community don't blame kids when they have a very strong reaction, a very strong protest to being bullied, as they should, right? They should be protesting this. So I think that that's kind of where it's getting at. Obviously, you're familiar with the epigenetic research, and the epigenetic stuff is so hot. And basically what epigenetics is telling us is that the DNA sequence obviously does not change, but the expression of genes change as a consequence of our environment. So early adversity has been shown to change whether or not a gene gets turned on for breast cancer or not. And I think that we fail to ignore that the stress of being bullied by our peers, which interferes with our fundamental need to belong, would be equivalent to living in a house where you're abused by your caregiver, would be equivalent to living in extreme poverty, and that sort of thing. So I'm hoping that I'm highlighting it. And also, too, I think sometimes it causes a bit of fear because then people will send me emails and say, so is my brain damaged? Am I ever going to recover? We don't know yet. I mean, the epigenetics research hasn't shown how it recovers. So we know that some genes are activated and others are silenced through epigenetic processes. But I think that it's where we need to go to understand health trajectories, mental and physical health trajectories. All that to say, I probably didn't answer your question, but I recognize what you're saying, that we all need to come together, intersect our knowledge bases so that we can be better informed in preventing this.
Thank you.
I was thinking about that connection between the genotype and the phenotype, and the idea that, well, we don't go around with a badge of this is my phenotype. Or my genotype rather, but kids somewhat figure out who's going to be reactive to things, and I heard a little bit of this in Robert's talk, and we know that some kids are targeted because they're more emotionally responsive, and that from a behavior standpoint is pretty reinforcing for the person that's perpetrating the bullying. If I start bullying Jaana and the cool cucumber there, she's just like disengages from that and doesn't react, that's not very reinforcing for me. And so I wonder at some point if kids are kind of picking up on the emotional ability of individuals and targeting them there. And I'm reminded of a series of articles that came out, I think it was Social Development in 1999. It was around this idea, do kids that bully have a superior theory of mind? And so for a long time we thought kids that were bullying lacked social skills and that they were just doing this in lieu of pro-social. And there might very well be some kids that just don't know how to react, so it's a skill deficit. But there was a very interesting article that kind of back and forth. In fact, there was a commentary that involved Nikki Crick and Ken Dodge, who will be with us tomorrow, and talking about this idea from a social information processing, that they're not bumbling idiots, kids that are bullying, quite often that they are using social cues and picking up on things in their reactivity. So it was kind of interesting to think a little bit about that, how there's that dynamic between who's being targeted and who's perpetrating that and their social cognitive intellect to some extent, and how they're able to anticipate somebody reacting or learning from that. So maybe we're not as far away of people being able to read some extent, at least on the phenotype rather than the genotype, and it's a big extrapolation from that point. But I don't know if you had any kind of thoughts about that, or Robert, yours, about how do people actually, or kids, target their victims and get reinforced, and that issue of emotional reactivity might be one indicator that's really reinforcing for some kids.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't have enough data to say, what's going on the ground. All we know is sort of from a bird's eye view what's happening over a longer period
Well, this
of
is
time.
your next grant application. You're collecting genetic data on top of the social network. That's definitely innovative in a NIH kind of framework.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting to think about how can you map the social relationships as well as the genetic profiles. So.
They both make really cool pictures.
Yeah.
But can I add those? So when Robert's writing his grant, he might want to consider, there was a recent study that just came out with Wilfrid Laurier, so a Canadian university, where they manipulated power and its effect on the brain. And when somebody was afforded power, the way they perceived others was they paid less attention to them, they were less aroused by them. And when you think about it, power holders, in a sense, have to be morally disengaged. Well, we would hope that that's the mechanism, because how could they do some of the cruel things that they do, right? So it's actually amazing, because at the neurological level, the brain is actually dampening down, in a sense, to the plight of victims when they hold power. But when they don't hold power, they're acutely aware of their environment and the distress signals of others. So when you hold power and you're bullying others, you're not aware of the distress signals, but when you have no power, you're acutely aware of your environment.
I'll just add to that there's also some interesting work that's been done that decouples status and power. So people act quite differently if they have power but not respect, as you might see in airports sometimes.
One of our youth panelists, is it Glenn? Yes. So, Glenn, your question?
No, go ahead.
We'll go back and forth.
Hi, I'm Glenn Cantave. I'm a junior at Wesleyan University. I'm one of the youth panelists. I just want to say it's an honor to be standing here in front of all of you. My question is directed towards Tracy. So basically, speaking from personal experience, I've come to realize that when I was younger, I was super sensitive, and when bullies came and attacked me, in a sense, it really did affect me. And I've come to realize that as I've gotten older, I've grown sort of a thicker skin. And speaking as a government major, I don't know too much about my brain, or I don't know, the buildup of it, or the cortisol levels or anything. But I was just curious about, you said lower, so over time when one experiences high levels of stress, they produce less cortisol. So does that imply that, some sort of tolerance to stress? If certain emotional triggers are hit later on in life after experiencing extreme levels of stress, are you more immune to it, or does that, yeah.
Another great question. I think it speaks to adaptation. So one interesting finding, again, is about Holocaust survivors having low cortisol. And in fact, their offsprings also have lower cortisol, and they didn't directly experience the trauma associated with the Holocaust. And perhaps having the system damp down, in a sense, downgrade itself in terms of that stress reaction, might actually protect somebody. So perhaps having high cortisol in certain contexts is good, and if it continues to be elevated, it confers risks for cardiovascular events and the like. So the system might adapt and downregulate. So the mechanism's a little bit difficult to understand because it's differentially linked to also different health outcomes. So, for example, high cortisol is related to depression, whereas low cortisol is related to post-traumatic stress disorder. My interest is, why is it that almost every study that's been done looking at cortisol levels in children who've been bullied, why do they always show low cortisol? So our longitudinal study showed high and then low. So it showed that rhythm that you would expect, that pattern. But I think it really highlights, and what I was trying to focus on this, is highlighting the fact that this is a real stressor. This is significant. This is the pattern that you see in war veterans, Holocaust survivors, rape victims, people with post-traumatic stress disorder. They're all low. So the stressor of bullying should not be diminished, should not be thought of as a rite of passage, something that makes us stronger. I don't know how that makes us stronger. Does that help?
Yeah,
okay.
I completely agree with that. I'm just curious as far as later down the line when similar emotional triggers are played with in that sense.
Yeah.
Is the same level of cortisol released?
We don't know. We don't know. So one would think. So when you look at, for example, war veterans' low cortisol profile, they're no longer within the context of the war zone, and they're still displaying low cortisol with the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So is it this thing where the system is now altered and that is going to be the way the system is going to respond to future stressors? And does that last 5 years? Does that last 10 years? Does that last 25 years? I don't know. We don't know yet. So we need longitudinal studies where we study the HPA axis over time across different stressors. So it's complicated. The data seems to suggest that it changes your HPA activation, so it changes the way you respond to future stressors, and it seems to be stable. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
There's an interesting study that Doug Granger, I think he was a senior author, he had been at Penn State and has kind of moved around as the salometrics work. I think it was one of his students had done a study about anticipatory anxiety, and so they found that kids that had a history of peer victimization had anticipatory anxiety and dysregulated cortisol. It was a little irregular, as some kids were high, some were low. They just kind of bundled it together as dysregulation. In anticipation of going into contexts where they thought they would be bullied, like the cafeteria, the lunchroom. So relatively small study, but very interesting in terms of this idea of anticipation of stress and how that relates to cortisol functioning. So.
Just to add one thing, I think that the best way to think about cortisol is not whether it's high or low, whether it's high or low. So whether it's different, right? So it's dysregulation. Some will be high and some will be low, but it's dysregulated.
Yeah, that's a term I generally use because it's hard to predict who's going to be high and who's going to be low. We spent some time trying to figure out, are your externalizers, low with the dissociation kind of pattern, or your anxiety kids on a physiological level, highly anxious, but we couldn't really map those core patterns onto internalizing versus externalizing following bullying, but interesting work.
So hi, I'm Deborah Tumpkin. I'm the Director of Bullying Prevention for the Robert F. Kennedy Center. My question goes more towards Bob's research, but want all of you to weigh in. So for the last, let's say, 20 years since the U.S. has gotten involved in bullying prevention, our bullying prevention efforts have generally assumed that bullying is a bad behavior, so if we tell kids to say no to bullying, they're not going to bully. Sort of reminds me of Just Say No campaigns around drug use that we know don't work. So my question, knowing that bullying actually plays a social benefit, that we know that being aggressive can actually lead to social status, how do we actually convince kids not to be aggressive and not to bully, considering they have a social gain and peers are perhaps the most important people in the lives of adolescents?
I kind of want to dodge this one.
Exit stage left.
Yeah, that's a huge problem, and I don't have a lot of great answers. I do think that one of the, like I think I alluded to in the talk, one, I think, area of promise is to work on encouraging kids to develop a fewer number of better friendships. And I think a lot of kids don't recognize what a good friend is, and they don't know how to be a good friend. And I wouldn't suggest that everything just takes care of itself, but I think there are things, parents can do to help kids recognize what it means to be a good friend. I think schools, I'm kind of interested in thinking about ways that schools could be reorganized to offer maybe a wider array of activities that can sort of foster, interest-based friendships that, as opposed to sort of the kind of traditional social organization of a high school, which is very much a pyramid with a few prestigious activities on top. It's not always football and cheerleading, but it's often activities like that. But regardless of which activity, there's often some that are really celebrated and others are not. And those kids who are in the middle and the bottom of the pyramid are become kind of invisible.
I'll add to that. I think increasingly we're recognizing from Faris's work and others' work, Phil Rotkin, that kids do have different social status and they have different kind of social capital, right? So in the intervention area, there's a program called Green Dot, which is a sexual violence prevention program where they identify polls or public opinion leaders, so those kids that really have social capital. And as opposed to going in and doing a universal program for, and this is just one example, a universal program for sexual violence and rape prevention education, they find out who has social capital and who may be the kind of attitude shift changers, and you train them, you plug them back in, kind of drawing upon some of what we know in industrial and organizational psychology, right? We haven't been creative beyond doing universal programming. We had a meta-analysis, and there are programs out there that focus on bystander intervention, and I'm sure the panel will talk about this in intervention, where we found in high schools an effect size increase in bystander intervention, effect size of 0.44, which is unheard of in school-based intervention. So I think that we need to be much more creative in the ways we think about this, and you'll hear from Professor Cornell about school climate, that it matters. So we can do all we want to do, understanding the structure of the kids, but how can we work together with teachers to promote different types of egalitarian classrooms, right? That's Phil Rotkin's work. If there's a hierarchical classroom, there's more aggression. Do teachers understand the networks in their classrooms? What about the administration, right? So it has to be at every level.
I'd like to add just a little bit on that, that indeed I'd say the only way to change the high status of the bullies is to focus on the bystanders. That is, they are the audience for the bully. And bullies love the audience. That is, they want a reaction. They want not only a reaction from their victim, but they also live from the fact that everybody else is in awe and joins the bully rather than the victim. So it is those very dynamics that need to be changed, and in fact, as Dorothy mentioned, that's where we have learned about some gains. But one way that how you convince kids, I think Dorothy also made a point about that come middle school, high school, and you tell kids that bullying is not allowed, and that's almost like a challenge for them, that's what they need to do. And what we've done, what we've noticed when I work with schools is that there's a very different way of thinking about it. And I think Dan Alveus was the first one who wrote about this, that when you turn things around for kids and say, what are your rights in this school? And they start sort of listing what are their rights. One of them is that they can come to school and not be afraid. And if you sort of think about establishing the rules around that notion, that this is about protecting your rights and your peers' right to be not to be afraid, that's when you can have a little bit more power in your words.
Great, thank you. Question over here.
Hi, I'm Katie Gorsak, and I'm with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and I help run StopBullying.gov. My question, sorry, Bob, another one for you, but I don't think this is going to be as tough of a question as Deb's. So you talk a lot about, and I thought it was very interesting, the whole peer groups and within, the higher clout status peer groups. But I was curious about the other peer groups that exist. As we talk about, there's a lot of emphasis put on the higher class, the cheerleaders, the football players. But I'm sure within other types of peer groups that might have been peer groups that had experienced bullying at a younger age. Has there been any research to that type of pecking order within other types of peer groups, and if any of the experiences that they had as a younger youth with perhaps being bullied by somebody, if that has impacted their ability to not engage in that type of behavior or be a little bit more perceptive of it?
Thank you for the question. I think it's an interesting one, and I'm intending to. It's one of the ones I'm actually interested in pursuing in the coming months. Specifically examining the dynamics within friendship groups, large or crowds, not necessarily, maybe, one of my friends, Jim Moody, defined a friendship group as the number of people who can sit at a cafeteria table together. And I think that's a good unit to be looking at, but I'm also interested in the slightly larger crowd that these kids are in. But regardless of the aggregation, I think it is really important to understand how these groups can have different sort of subcultures within them, and I really wish I had data that went back to elementary school. I think some folks here might have that kind of information, though. I'll leave it to the field.
Anyone else care to respond to that? Next.
Hi, Ellen Selke. I'm a pediatrician and adolescent medicine fellow at Seattle Children's, and thank you all for your perspectives. And I really, I wanted to talk a little bit about what you had said, Jaana, about that a lot of the outcome studies on bullying prevention programs don't look at the sequelae of depression and distress and the things that I see in the office. And so I guess I'm wondering if you all could comment on, we want to talk about bullying prevention, but also harm reduction to those who are bullied and the bullies. And I'm especially interested in hearing what you might have to say, Tracy, about if we know that there are kids who are predisposed to, having worse outcomes, are there therapies that we can reach out with them to early so that we can mitigate some of those health effects later on?
I'll just quickly say that in fact, so obviously I'm major into the refocusing our attention on the harm reduction and really thinking about, we know so much about these kids who are at risk, whether we have the genetic data or whether we have the endocrine data. We don't need that. There are a lot of behavioral and physical observations that can help us decide who is at risk. I want to go back to the earlier notion of connectedness before, because we have so many school administrators and teachers here, is that one of the things when I talk to school personnel always strikes me is that when I talk about the lowest ranked individuals who are most likely to get targeted, they look at one another noddingly. And they know very well, and they talk about, it's so-and-so who sits at lunch alone. They know who these kids are. And the number of schools that I've gone and how few times there's a remedy available, but there have been a few. And they've been a very wise librarian, a very wise, very well-liked teacher, keeps their door open during lunch. And better yet, if that lunch opportunity could be indeed, like Bob, you mentioned, be structured around, it's not the room for the rejects, but it is a room that brings people together with specific interests. That would be a big step forward. So I think that I disagree slightly on how horrendous this task is to prevent the harmful effects of bullying, because I think we have an awful lot of smart teachers, educators out there who are doing little things that can make a huge difference.
I think that's the biggest challenge. There's so much heterogeneity in who gets victimized, and Bob's work shows that even popular kids get victimized. But my biggest challenge in doing this work is we could get kids to not actively harm somebody, so not call them names, punch them, spit on them, but we can't get them to include them. And so the kid that sits alone at lunch and we can't get anybody to include them really breaks my heart, and I have no idea how we can fix that. But I think adult leadership would help a little bit. But I wanted to highlight that there's some research that's just coming out showing that, so there's a few meta-analyses that have shown that typically kids become depressed as a consequence of being bullied. But there are some recent studies that have shown an opposite pattern. So Conchal just published a study. We just published a study in the Journal of Abnormal Child Psychology that replicates that study, where we see kids are first depressed and then they get victimized over time. And it's an interesting pattern because the vulnerability of their depression, their depression makes them vulnerable to being victimized. And I'm not too sure what the mechanism is. So it could be that when you think about somebody who's depressed, they're not really engaged. They may come across as aloof, that sort of thing. But it could also be the bias that is part of depression, the triad of depression. So they have a pessimistic view of themselves, of the future, of the world. So perhaps when they're reporting on their depression and then their future victimization, they're looking to support that bias in a sense. So just to say that, I know I keep saying it, but it's complicated. So I think that it just speaks to the fact that we really need large longitudinal studies. We really need an investment in this to understand this type of heterogeneity. When you think about it from a model of equifinality and multifinality, so some kids start on the same trajectory and have different outcomes. Some start on different trajectories and end in the same place. And we need to understand that kind of diversity in trajectories.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Mark Hatzenbuehler. I'm on the faculty at the School of Public Health at Columbia. And first of all, I just want to thank all of you for really great talks. It's really impressive, this sort of multi-level, multi-method data. I'm speaking actually on the policy panel tomorrow, and so I wanted to sort of anticipate where we might be going with that. And in particular, I had a question for Dorothy. You alluded to this comment quickly in your talk, and I wondered if you could unpack this a little more, which is thinking about the surrounding politics as a sort of intervention moderator in some ways, that we might know effective interventions, but there are certain contexts where we can't deliver them. And I was thinking in particular about some of these new so-called no promo homo policies where you can't mention sexual orientation in the schools, and just wondered, given your wealth of experience in this area, if you could talk a little bit more about how you've sort of worked around that, or what you've been able to do in the schools, particularly in areas where some of the policies or local environments may be sort of hostile to some of these interventions.
Yes. So I do quite a bit of work across the country. So when people say enumerated laws or laws that protect certain students, like LGBT, gender nonconforming students with disabilities, that's not the solution. I'll tell you, it's a good first step. So I can do stuff in the state of Colorado because they have a enumerated law, because there's a mandate, so I get to talk about LGBT youth. But at the same time in Colorado, there's some very conservative pockets of Colorado, and I like Colorado, so I'm not picking on Colorado. And so my approach is different depending on that context. In some parts of Colorado, I have to frame it as a school climate, school safety issue, but combine it with the fact that this is a mandate on their part. And they also have funding in the state for the teachers and administrators to get training around LGBT safety issues, right? So, and building trust with them, right? So, I mean, it's about relationships and connectedness too with the, policy and research. And our trial was in a state that has an anti-gay law. Right, so that's going to look very different in that state, and we did not get the reductions that we got in my state of Illinois. But even in my state right now, trying to launch a trial where I wanted to talk to 6th and 7th and 8th graders about the language that they use, there was a huge pushback. Remarkably, though, once we decided, say, okay, you don't really want us our kids talking about sexual orientation because then they may become gay. I mean, this is what we heard, right, even in big districts. And so what we then did was we backed up and we said, okay, clearly, like everybody else in the field, we have focused so much on students, and we have not recognized that there are adults in our schools and our communities that are toxic, that have the same biases that are actually modeling this behavior. So we're ramping up this randomized clinical trial, really focusing on the teacher and administrator professional development. So we're showing that material we would have shown to the kids, we're showing to the adults. And we've done some pilot testing within 10 minutes, right? If I show Straight Lace by Groundspark, great video, great way to get your kids to talk about gender and gender expression and intersectionality. Within 10 minutes of a training, I show this, and for example, there's a vignette of a girl, she's a girl, but she dresses like a boy, right, and straight-laced. And she talks about how just disturbing it is that, you know, people will mistake her and they'll make comments and degrading comments, and teachers will do the same. Well, if you just dressed like a girl, you wouldn't have all these issues. And I remember a couple weeks ago doing a pilot training in an alternative school, because we thought, well, we'll start with the alternative school. They've seen everything, right? Within 10 minutes, the teacher goes, "Is it my fault that she looks like a boy and I think she's a boy?" And I said, "Thank you. You just sped up this entire training. It's wonderful. Thank you for that. And I appreciate that you made that comment." I said, "But you imagine being in the middle school years when you actually may reject that student, or you may be so uncomfortable you don't know how to manage it." And then we had the best hour conversation. By the end of it, some of these resistant teachers were like, "This is what we need to do." Right? So I think we start with the adults. For too long, we've worked with the students.
I think we'll take a final question here, and then we're going to break for lunch, and there'll be an opportunity after our break for some other questions. Belinda?
Sure. Hi. I'm Belinda Sims from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And there's been a lot of talk about risk and protective factors and consequences of bullying, and I didn't hear any mention of substance use problems, and I wondered if the panel could talk about that. Then my second question goes to Tracy in talking about some of the neuroendocrine cortisol effects. And I know in the maltreatment literature, Phil Fisher has done work with very young maltreated children and found that the intervention that they've developed for foster families and biological families has actually been able to modify that biological risk. And I wondered if you could address that.
So I'll take the first one. I'll take the first one. So there were a number of slides. We were limited to 15 slides. So some of my slides talked about the association between family violence, bullying perpetration, and alcohol and drug use, right, in this longitudinal study. And that was just published in the Journal of Research on Adolescence, so I can send you that. It was very, very clear that family violence led to an increase in bullying perpetration and also physical fighting. And then subsequently, over time, and these are 5th and 6th and 7th graders, they were starting to use. We also have a paper coming out in developmental psychology, we hope, very soon, that looks at peer victimization and peer delinquency and then the onset of alcohol and drugs use. And the models fit great. It is clear that both those kids that are engaged in bullying directed toward others and those that are the targets, that they're at risk for the uptake of alcohol and drugs. And you should know in our trial of the socio-emotional learning, we not only reduced physical fighting, but we delayed the uptake of alcohol and drug use in the intervention schools. And look for that too.
We also see some preliminary evidence that the victims of bullying are more likely to fall into sort of internalizing pathways of substance use as a way of coping. And as you, I'm sure, know, that those are associated with, I think, higher rates of addiction problems later on.
Final comment by Tracy.
I think it's right to hold me a bit more accountable about what I'm saying in terms of, we know that there's neuroplasticity, so I would expect there's going to be positive change. I would also expect that when we intervene on behalf of children who are victimized, there's going to be recovery, which then just highlights what our task is, right? That we're going to have to reduce this burden.
Wasn't it Kurt Levine that said the best way to figure out how something works is actually do an experiment and try to change it? And so some of the elegant studies that Phil Fisher and I know some using an attachment framework. Cassidy has been doing some similar type of work to try to actually intervene with really high-risk kids and seeing not only behavioral change, but some of their HPA axis responsivity. So those are nice studies and really provide an elegant test of these theoretical models. Well, thanks so much to our audience here and to our panel. Did you want to kind of bring this back out? Pass it back over to Fred, who will kind of bring us back for next steps.
Thank you so much. This is terrific. I really learned a lot this morning. So we're going to break for lunch now, reconvene at 12:50. Our committee will meet in room 125 we were this morning. There's a cafeteria in the basement for guests here, as well as some restaurants in the area. But please come back in time for reconvening at 12:50. Thank you.